Good afternoon and welcome to the Duel debate, ending the war in Ukraine, justice or peace. My name is Tobias Hagmann and I am a senior program officer working here at swisspeace. The Russian aggression in Ukraine, which started 11 months ago, has caused the death of several hundred thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, as well as Russian troops. It has displaced millions of Ukrainians inside and outside of the country. The war, unfortunately, shows no signs of abating. How can it be stopped? What should be the main priority to end the conflict? Should it be to work towards a peaceful settlement between Kyiv and Moscow to avoid further bloodshed? And if peace is the objective, should it be pursued at all costs? More importantly, maybe, what form and shape should a future peace take? Or, to the contrary, is justice the main objective, meaning that Ukrainians and their allies have to defeat the enemy first, recover all territories currently occupied by Russian federal forces, hold Putin and the Russian leadership accountable, and obtain compensation? If justice rather than peace is the main objective, what should justice look like? Which one of these two goals, peace or justice, is more realistic and feasible? And what are their political, practical, and international implications? Debating these tricky questions are our Ukrainian colleagues, Dr. Yuliia Mieriemova, on my right, and Dr. Maksym Yakovlyev, on my left. Dr. Yuliia Mieriemova is a postdoctoral researcher in the Gender, War and Security Research Group here at the University of Basel. She used to work as a journalist in her previous life, and Yuliia is currently conducting research on the role of women in the war in Ukraine. Dr. Maksym Yakovlyev is the head of the Department of International Relations and the School for Policy Analysis at the National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in Kiev. He's also a member of the Public Council of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and Maksym conducts research on the impact of the current war on international relations and security discourses. Welcome both, Maksym and Yuliia. Welcome to the Basel Peace Forum. We thank you for being with us today. I think in particular we thank Maksym, who undertook a long and very tiring travel to get here, traveling some 27 hours between Kiev and Poland. One important disclaimer before we start the debate: our panelists will take one position in this debate. Yuliia, you will argue for peace, while Maksym will defend justice. But these positions are not necessarily identical with Yuliia and Maksym's personal views. They're academics. You can assume that they're going to have more nuanced and differentiated views. Yuliia, hopefully. Yuliia, let me start with you. As a Ukrainian citizen and scholar, why should a peaceful settlement of the conflict be the main priority?
Thank you. I have recently conducted interviews with Ukrainian female fighters, and they talked about their plans for after the war. They spoke of urgency of living in the present, not being preoccupied with something that might never happen. They want simple things, really. Paint their apartments in all shades of green, go kayaking, have sushi in their favorite local spot, lose some weight, start working on a brilliant business idea. They want their lives back. They want peace. And when I asked them what peace meant, they said, it meant victory. They did not say the defeat of the aggressor. They said our victory, and that means peace for them. That's how Ukraine needs peace, because peace means victory. Now, the very binary between peace and justice is a false one. It's important to move away from the dichotomy of peace or justice precedents because there are more holistic and long-term approaches in every local context. And yet, in this debate today, I take a stance for peace. Not because I'm a feminist or a woman, but because my position is informed by practical necessity of showing strength to choosing peace first. Peace that might not be conventional, the kind of peace that Ukraine has the right to choose for itself at the negotiation table, when it is stronger than the aggressor. Now, peace and justice implementation might intertwine, but in some communities, it is very important to prioritize peace. That, for example, concerns people who have lived under Russian occupation for the last 8 years. Now, the vast majority of Ukrainians regard the residents of Crimea and Donbass as victims that need help for Ukraine, and peace will help them realize what it means to be a part of Ukraine again. The war is tough for millions of people, literally millions. Millions of traumatized, lost, scared, but very brave people too. It is tough for men who are fighting. It is tough for those men who do not want to take up arms and are not able to leave the country. It's tough for women who are fighting, and not just inside the armed forces, but also the prejudices against them. It's tough for people who live with disabilities, under occupation, in rural areas, IDPs, the majorities of whom are women and children. It's tough for refugees, being on the periphery of Western whiteness. That's how Ukraine needs peace, because peace means people. Now, militarization of Ukrainian society is another reason why peace is essential to all further changes. It might be one of the biggest long-term structural challenges after the announcement of the ceasefire. It will lead to further exacerbation of economic, social, and political injustices, increase in gender-based violence, and a backlash in achieving gender equality. That's how Ukraine needs peace, because peace means fighting militarization. Peace is necessary to stop the destruction of the ecosystem and land, especially with the looming threat of future climate wars. Ukraine has possibly become the world's largest minefield due to the Russian aggression. Now, my grandma, who's 92 years old, has a story. And every time she's anxious, scared, worried, she tells this story. It's a story of a boy from her village who lost his both legs to a mine after the Second World War. She might not remember what she had for breakfast that day. She might not even remember the name of her daughter, but she remembers the story of a boy who lost his both legs to a mine after the Second World War. And that's how Ukraine needs peace, because peace means choosing nature for once. Peace is necessary to stop further centralization of power and consolidation of nationalist agenda and war economy. Ukraine doesn't seem to be able to afford not to have a strong national agenda these days, as a way to mobilize and unite the nation against the oppressor. And yet, it also means that while women are playing a key role in the humanitarian response, they are not fully involved in the decision-making process. Leading positions are almost exclusively held by men, which means inadequate representation of women's interests. Ukraine needs peace, but on its own terms. It should determine itself what peace looks like for its people and for its future. Thank you.
Thank you, Yuliia. Yuliia is saying peace means people. Maksym, Yuliia is saying peace means people. She's arguing that peace should be the main goal because Ukrainians need to get their lives back. The war has so many devastating long-term impacts on Ukrainian society itself. What is your view? Why should justice be the priority?
Thank you. Yuliia started, and I agree with her absolutely, with this interesting question of what we do when we start planning for after the war. And this is very important. Just imagine, and I try to imagine after Yuliia presented her arguments, just imagine, and I as a person who decided to stay in Kyiv without the whole war. I've been in Kyiv the whole time. This is my second travel from outside of the Kyiv during this almost the first year of the war, and I do understand how it feels to be in Kyiv all the time with missiles attacks and bombings and electricity outage and things like that. And I would also imagine a situation, what if the war ends at this particular point? It freezes. It just stops. But Putin would be still there in Kremlin. The Russian neo-imperial aggressive politics would be still there. Many Ukrainians under occupation suffering a lot. And there are many stories I know from my students who suffered occupation, for example, in Kherson. Some of them are still in the occupied areas. And there are many reports and histories of Ukrainian children forcefully taken from their families and forcefully adopted by Russians that would also be still there. And that's why I think justice should be also put into this very positively saying sentimental way, that justice is also getting Ukrainians back and reuniting families and having our children that were forcefully adopted by Russians, having them returned to Ukraine, and many also Ukrainians who were sent to special filtration camps. Just imagine we're living now in the modern developed world and there are still filtration camps, and also Ukrainians sent back to Siberia and far away from their homes as people who are politically whom Russians consider to be politically not very reliable, and this should also be put into the picture. Of course, here in Switzerland, when enjoying these peaceful conditions and no air sirens and no bombing alerts, this is a difficult situation. But I would imagine that if the war freezes right now and there is no justice achieved, there will be no long-standing peace conditions as such. I also agree with Yuliia that peace is about nature. I think that Crimea and the Russian occupation, we saw this really horrible pictures of thousands of dolphins, for example, and other sea animals who died because Russia uses Crimea, a very specific natural place of the European subcontinent, as its military base. Maybe they already have the nukes there in Crimea. And if the war stops right now, and Crimea is still an extremely militarized zone, without achieving justice, meaning demilitarizing Crimea and creating secure conditions for nature to recover itself, there would be no peace. I also would like to stress that in nowadays world, there is no such thing as local injustice. Once Putin or any other dictator decides to invade neighboring countries because of his imperial ambitions, if he is not punished, if retributions are not paid, then it is sorry to say, good examples for any other dictatorship to invade neighbors just because they see it fit and they think they're capable of it. Imagine that a nuclear power invades its neighbors just for the reason they want to have a sort of empire restored. This is very wrong. Thus, I think justice is a prerequisite for long-lasting peace, because freezing this conflict right now is not peace. And Yuliia is also right at hinting that we need to discuss the notion of peace, because if peace is used by Russia to accumulate more resources to attack again Ukraine, for example, to get drones from Iran, another country that suffers from an oppressive regime, and maybe if it provides Russia with ballistic missiles to attack Ukraine and destroy Ukraine again. We had the situation in 2014 where I might say that the situation froze and we got some sort of peace, but in 8 years Russia came back and attacked Ukraine in an unprecedented way. I also would like to say that this considering peace as something that is just freezing the war is wrong, that for people and for reuniting families, as I said, for being this on a more personal note, we all understand that there are occupied territories of Ukraine that need to be recovered, and this is important. Last but not least, for this sort of argument, I think that long-lasting peace means that those who are responsible for acts of violence are also held accountable, because without accountability there would be no peace, because once, as I said, we put the situation on hold without having Putin responsible, also his clique, and those who committed horrible crimes, because we also pictures of Bucha, Irpin, and other, especially occupied areas where, I repeat, we have filtration camps. We have torture rooms for children in Kharkiv Oblast recovered. And everybody in small villages and cities in Kharkiv knew that children and teenagers were tortured because they hide Ukrainian flag at their homes. For all these injustices, people need to be held accountable, and long-lasting peace means that in the world, no other dictator would dare to invade a neighboring country, because he knows what he or his clique or organization is risking is that they're going to be punished and that the world is not going to tolerate injustice. I think it's also important that we do some sort of play with words. Peace means fighting injustice. Peace means fighting for justice, and any injustice in the world needs to be punished in order that, as I repeat, no other dictator would ever invade a neighboring country and cause so many death, destructions, and things like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Maksym. You both made your argument very clear on a principled basis. Let us now talk about practicalities. If we take into account realpolitik, global geopolitics, as well as the military and political capacities on both sides, which strategy or which goal, peace or justice, is more realistic? Yuliia, what would a peace agreement or a peaceful conflict settlement look like in practical terms?
Thank you for the question. Now, I definitely agree with you, Maksym, when you said that peace for Ukraine doesn't mean freezing the conflict, nor does it mean quick fixes. Peace for Ukraine means strength, and that is the most important thing. Now, it is understandable that European citizens worry about the cost of economic sanctions and a threat of looming nuclear escalation. That is why many of you might be pressuring for finding quick solutions of immediate ceasefire or peace agreement. However, the polls also show that the countries that find themselves in unfortunate proximity to Russia, like Finland, for example, find it important to boost military support for Ukraine and also their own military spending, because they understand that quick fixes with peace in Ukraine would mean immediate threat to their own security. So what does peace for Ukraine entail? Strength. Peace for Ukraine entails the position of strength rather than concessions to Russia. Now, if we're talking about the practicality of obtaining peace through strength, here is what it means. Ukraine needs to come to the negotiating table having a strong position. That means being backed up with sufficient regular supply of newest weapons, having concrete numbers on the amount of financial support for the reconstruction efforts, and international unanimous agreements that would ensure full-fledged support for Ukraine. And this is exactly the scenario that should be pursued. Ukraine can show up to the negotiating table, giving the names of every child deported to Russia, like you said, every man and woman tortured for weeks and killed, every elderly that died out of hunger or under the debris of her own house, every girl or boy as young as 2 raped by the aggressors. But Russia won't listen. They don't have to. They already know it because they did it. What Ukraine needs instead is to show why Russia cannot keep doing that. And that is because of strength. That is a combination of what Ukraine are doing or Ukrainians are doing and what international community is providing. Now, as a feminist scholar, I must point to the limitation of the discussions about the use of violence as a way to eradicate violence. But I ask you to think of this example. When a woman confronts an abuser, is she justified to use violence to self-defend? Should she bother to fight back? I think the answer is evident. And so is the distinction between defensive and offensive violence. This is exactly what sanctions and supply of arms is: a defensive war, or rather an absolute preparedness to lead it. That is what European governments would need to do, convince their citizens, if they haven't already. And that is what Ukraine might bring to the negotiating table: strength. Now, there is an assumption that if Ukraine is seeking a Russian defeat, it is assumed to be prolonging conflict. Thus, more people would die, go missing, will be kidnapped or tortured. But arguably, if Ukraine stops fighting immediately, it will lose even more lives to the Russian occupiers, who kill, mass rape, and deport Ukrainians. Maybe the kind of peace agreement Ukraine needs is unconventional exactly because of that. It's not out of weakness, it's out of strength. Peace is a luxury that Ukraine cannot afford without the world's support. Peace for Ukraine does not mean freezing the conflict, nor does it mean quick fixes. It means showing strength and utmost support at the negotiating table, if Ukraine is indeed supported by the world. Now, there is a clear distinction between Ukrainian peace and the so-called Russian peace, which is oppressive and aims to eradicate those who do not comply, while peace for Ukraine means simply being safe home.
Thank you, Yuliia. Yuliia is saying peace, yes, but peace based on military strength. Maksym, what is your reaction to this? If we take the need for justice and accountability seriously, what needs to happen in practical terms? Von der Leyen just announced recently that the EU is ready to support, in the future, an international criminal court. What would that, for example, look like?
A good question, actually. I would like to start by reacting to what Yuliia said. I thought that maybe from the very beginning our discussion was a bit gendered, because there is a woman discussing for the peace arguments, and there is a man discussing for justice. But then Yuliia turned it away, turned it around, so to speak, and she presented arguments for strength, which I fully support and have nothing to oppose. So this is an interesting turn in our discussion. So I would continue into a geopolitical debate, but also based on what you asked regarding the international actions that can be taken and why justice is a priority. And I would continue with what I said previously and also talk about Russia. There was also a good example of Finland. I would like to start with that. Finland and Sweden joining NATO, because we saw that for them, it is very important to be protected, and we both understand that Finland and Sweden, they were ready to join NATO, which means, and especially Finland, is a country which is very interesting in many surveys, that many surveys say that there's a country where there's a question asked, are you ready to defend your country with weapons and be ready to join the military? And in any questions or surveys like that, Finland scores the most on the European subcontinent because they were ready to do so, because they understand the threat Russia poses to them, and they have also the historical experience of being oppressed by Russia and Russian Empire, and then the war Finland fought with the Soviet Union. It is also a good example why a country needs to be strong enough to oppose any aggression, and this being strong, it means also what I would call justice in terms of memberships in organizations to which any country can also contribute. Before this war and full military invasion, in Ukraine we're discussing whether we should join NATO and the European Union. Of course, the European Union is more about values, and I think Ukraine demonstrated with the whole world that we stand for many values. Just to give you an example, and this is something we discuss in Ukraine, there is war, casualties, and people are dying, but there was a petition supported by many Ukrainians who signed it to the President of Ukraine to allow for LGBT and same-sex partnerships, because there are so many LGBT soldiers fighting at the front lines. For them, it is important to have their rights protected. And this is also justice for a minority. And discussions like that take place in Ukraine during the war now, which shows that in that respect, we support the European values for which Ukrainians stand and actually fight the Russian aggression. This is also important. I would like to say that this protection from Russia in the future can also be should be based on just premises, where we say that it is unjust to invade neighboring country, but it is interesting that we need to have international organizations that show support and actually stand for their values by providing Ukraine with more support. So I have nothing to add that what Yuliia said, but I would like to say and bring up a position about Russia, because we're talking about Russia, the invader, and it's true, and there are many things happening inside Russia that need a special attention. Before we started this debate, we discussed briefly, and this is something we see from Ukrainian perspective. For example, on international level, once you have a Department of Slavic Studies anywhere in the world, that would be mostly dedicated to the studies of Russia. And I think this is unjust to limit so many Slavic people around the world. There are many of us, different Slavic peoples, to the study of Russia. This is a huge limitation. I think this is unjust. We need to bring justice to study many Slavic peoples. But another thing and point is, once you study Russia, you study Russian culture. Russia is still a huge empire, or near empire, with so many peoples there being oppressed and deprived of the basic rights. Just to give you two examples, you know that the Burats, a nation that live close to the Mongolian border, who are Buddhist, and there are just 500,000 Burats in the world. But Burats sent to Ukraine to die in front lines, because Buryatia is one of the most economically deprived Russian region, still being exploited by Russia, and this is just horrible, because this nation cannot survive, and I think this nation has the right for self-determination, for its development and growth, and is a unique nation far away from Europe, actually, but this is true. Second example, the first child being born this year in St. Petersburg, which is considered to be the Russian cultural capital, was a Tuvin. Teva or Tuva is the nation also in Russia, and they do not look European, basically. And there were so many racial... Shoigu, the Russian minister, we call in Ukraine the minister of war, he's actually a Tuvin himself. So many racial commands that those Asians should stick to where they live, not come to St. Petersburg and things like that. This is something that shows that this defeat, military defeat for Russia, is a chance to actually reinvent itself, to think about itself. And I think, as I repeat, bringing justice would also mean that so many nations within Russia that are oppressed, economically deprived, would have the voice, would have the position, if they really want to invade any country, for the Russian imperial narratives or something like that. And this is important to know. I think this restoration of violated international order is also very important, because, as I would repeat and strengthen my argument, there is no such things as a local injustice, and we need to pay particular attention what would be the consequences of this war. Restoring justice also means possibilities for many countries to transform, to adapt, and that's why I think that what we should start with is actually restoring justice, bringing justice, and also taking a look at so many peoples and nations that are deprived and oppressed, that can also actually benefit from restoring the justice, as I said, and bringing those who started this war to responsibility.
Thank you, Maksym. Very strong and good points on Russian Empire. We still live with empires, not only in Russia, but also in other parts of the world. Our dual debate is nearing its end. Yuliia, I would like to ask you to take just 1 minute and to basically do two things. Number one, let's not talk about the international community. Let's talk about Switzerland, a small, apparently innocent country in the middle of Europe. What should Switzerland do, number one? And a concluding statement. And I will ask you to do the same, Maksym, and then we'll wrap off our debate.
Now, I should say that Switzerland has a very particular role to play, because it is one of the largest recipients of Russian public capital in the world. And as we all know, all wars are driven by money. This is exactly what Switzerland can do in order to fully participate in supporting Ukraine. And at the end of my statement, I should rather say a few words about peace in general, because I believe that it is really paradoxical how peace is always subtle. It's often understood as a sign of weakness. It's feminized. It's not even noticed until it is lost. And yet, I choose to vouch for peace, not because I'm a pacifist. I am not. Pacifism has significantly failed again, but because peace is the ultimate goal, of which justice is a significant part, but only a part. Ukraine will build peace on its own terms this time, the peace that is necessary for Ukraine and for its people. We have to be hopeful. This is our superpower. Thank you.
Okay. My minute. I think Switzerland is a good example of resilience, and we have a lot to learn from Switzerland. This is my first point. I would also support the Yuliia's argument. You see, this is my role to support her arguments because they're so good today. I read the local newspaper this morning in my hotel about Ignacio Cassis and this statement about how you can transfer the money frozen by Russian oligarchs frozen in Swiss banks. It's a huge, I do understand there's a huge societal debate how to do that. And I like this point. There's a lot of arguments brought about we need legislation for that. You need a referendum for that. You need some good points. And this is what Switzerland can teach all of us, that you just do not do a decision just out of your emotions. You need a good arguments, you need a legal base, and this is a very good point. This is my second trip out of Kyiv during this war, and the first was to Lugano Peace Conference, and I'm grateful for Switzerland for hosting great events and for assisting Ukrainians. And another thing what Switzerland can teach us, that there are unique cases that cannot be just replicated. When people start saying that Ukraine needs to be neutral somehow, Ukraine is already not neutral because we decided to join the European Union, we decided to be Europeans in many respects. And what Switzerland has as a good example is the Swiss militarized or armed neutrality. Switzerland is a good example that you can stay strong. Switzerland is a good example that we need legal basis, we cannot do emotional decisions. And as a Ukrainian, I'm very grateful to all the support that Swiss nations provides to Ukrainians during this war. Thank you.
Thank you both for excellent arguments, Maksym and Yuliia. Listening to you, it becomes very clear that there can be no peace without justice, but neither can there be justice without peace to end this conflict. This might sound trivial, but it's absolutely not trivial. Any one-sided approach focusing on either justice or peace is likely to fail and create more problems. The international community, but also Western publics, are well advised to take this into account, and you made this point very forcefully, Yuliia, and you as well, Maksym, and to listen to Ukrainian priorities when it comes to this issue.